Okay, it is 11:45 and we are going to get started. I just want to welcome everyone. If you were at the beginning of during the introduction, right before Dr. Fry Brown came on, you have seen me. My name is Quinta Ellis Parmelli, and I'm the co-host with LaKesha for this summit. And I am so happy to have you all with us, but we are certainly honored to have Angellica Sweat with us this morning, and she will be facilitating the physicians of the soul, gatekeepers of the mind. And so I did ask her, was there anything in particular she wanted to share? And it wasn't. So hopefully you will learn a lot about her as she gives her presentation. I am excited. And I know she is as well. You will be able to ask questions and dialogue with her and each other in the chat. So please, please, please utilize that. Afterwards, you will also be able to connect with Angellica to ask her, get more information about her as an individual and her expertise. And so please make sure you take advantage of that and through the networking capability in this platform. And without anything else, Miss Angellica Sweat.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very low key, so that's why you don't hear me say a lot of introductions. I just love Jesus, and that's about enough for me right now. So we're going to hop right in because we are going to be covering a lot of ground in a short amount of time. And today, what we're really going to talk about is clergy perceptions. Even if you're not a clergy person, we all are in some way, shape, or form are related to discipleship. And so this session is really designed to look at the rhetoric that we use as it relates to mental health. A lot of times what we do is that we say things without necessarily thinking through them, right? And so today is really designed to begin to be a discovery session where you all will be able to think critically through rhetoric, think through our language that we use, our biblical narratives that we use as it relates to mental health. Quinta, thank you again for the opportunity to share. And then as I kind of go through this, you'll learn a little bit more about me. I definitely want to give thanks to family, Amy Zion Church in Charlotte, North Carolina. I also want to send a special shout out to Dr. Marilyn Lovett, who actually pushed me into the work of research and pushed me further along, and not just asking questions for myself, but begin asking the questions on a macro level and begin to explore what does it mean to really have mental wellness inside of the church. So a little bit about me. I grew up in a rural town in North Carolina. As a child, I loved being outside. My favorite candy is Kit Kats. But after experiencing some childhood trauma, there were changes in my behavior. I was sad. I was uninterested by most things that were appropriate for my age group. By definition, I was probably considered a loner and withdrawn. And then by the end of my 8th grade year, I was self-mutilating and I had an attempted suicide. Soon after that, I was diagnosed with having generalized anxiety disorder, major depressive disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder. As a Black teen growing up in rural North Carolina with a strict Christian upbringing, when I say strict, I mean very strict, there was some confusion about how to navigate my new normal. On one end, I had family saying, don't say anything, out of sight, out of mind. Or it was just me being dramatic. On the other end, it was an issue of faith and sin. And so I was torn between these two polarities for a lot of my life. And as I grew older, I found myself in and out of hospitalizations and psychiatric wards for my mental condition. And then at that same time, while all of this chaos is going on, I accepted my call to preach. And I began preaching at 16. And as that progressed, I went to college, I went to a Christian university, and I dropped out after my first semester. I completely could not handle the pressure of going to college. I was a first generation student. And so I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to go. And so I ended up going and turning my focus back to the church. And as I was in church and as I began preaching more and trying to just understand my faith journey, I recognized then that what was happening with my body wasn't correlating to what was being said or what I was preaching in my Bible. And so for a few years, there was this like roller coaster of faith between my spirituality and my mind. And then I returned to school on a wing and a prayer, literally, to finish my undergraduate degree. And I ended up getting my degree in what initially I thought was going to be religion, but ended up actually transitioning over to psychology. And then in my senior year of finishing my undergraduate degree, I began doing my research for my undergraduate thesis, which is the culmination of what we'll talk about today. And I chose mental health in the Black church. Today, my diagnosis has changed since then, from major depressive disorder to bipolar disorder 2, generalized anxiety disorder, and still post-traumatic stress disorder. And since then, you see the picture on your screen of my support and my family, and they have helped me to really become stable in my journey. They've helped me to finish up my Master of Divinity. And so now, while things have a little bit changed for me, I mean, I'm in a different season of my life. My interest in the intersectionality of Black faith and mental health has not changed. I still ask the tough questions, and I still continue to want to ask this question: what are we doing in the church today? My love for Kit Kats is still the same. So, if anybody wants to mail me some, just let me know. But that's just a little bit about me. So I say all that to say mental illness is not a sin. It's not a sin. And that's my stance, and that's my framework for today. And we'll journey through this framework together to understand what mental illness is, what denotes mental illness, how rhetoric and perceptions influence both of those concepts, and then how does the gospel we proclaim offer space for mental illness and for mental wellness, because they are different. And then again, as you have questions, feel free to drop them off in the comments. I'll kind of keep watching as well. So again, this is a journey, and it's a discovery journey. My goal today is not to give you all the answers, but to give you space and room to be able to think about what it is and how you define mental illness. Our objective will be to critically examine clergy perspectives and willingness to relate to mental health. This includes an evaluation of biblical narratives, our own religious rhetoric, and spiritual practices as traditions for illuminating the lived experience of those facing mental illness. We'll look at data, we'll look at statistics, then we'll look at our theological and biblical perspectives, and then we'll close with discussion and collaboration that will promote mental health as we rethink church and sacred engagement moving forward. So what is the role of the church? Within the Old Testament, gatekeepers were those who ministered in the house of the Lord. Gatekeepers were responsible for the maintenance, security, and resources of the temple. In the New Testament, the synoptic writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, record Jesus as emphasizing that those who are well have no need for a physician. Rather, those who are sick need a physician. So together, this is the use of the biblical significance of spiritual caretakers. This is probably the earliest, maybe not the earliest, but this is one of the biblical foundations in which we understand what the need is for spiritual caretakers, both in the New and Old Testament, as they provide for God's people. Looking forward now, almost 2,000 years later, we see that gatekeepers are not unique to Jerusalem nor to Israel. Globally, the church has become a hospital for the spiritually sick and mentally ill. Considered physicians of the soul, gatekeepers of the mind, clergy and church leaders are looked to as a source for spiritual care and mental support for the unmet needs of parishioners. According to the Surgeon General National Strategy for Suicide Prevention, gatekeepers can be anyone, including those who are strategically positioned to recognize and refer someone at risk for suicide. I would argue that this also includes those who can recognize and refer someone who is at risk for a mental illness or that needs mental care. Okay. In terms of statistics and what we're looking at, while there are many definitions to describe mental illness, the common foundation is that mental illness is a condition of the brain that impairs life functioning. This typically is characterized by a combination of abnormal thoughts, perceptions, emotions, behaviors, and relationships with others. Statistically, 1 in 5 US adults live with a mental illness, and that's according to the National Institute of Mental Health. Among those living with mental illness in the United States, 19.8 million or 42.6% received mental health services in the past year. So what does that look like? Say we're in a room of 100 people. That means 20 people live with a mental illness. And out of those 20, only 8 of those individuals are receiving mental health services. 100 people, 20 live with mental illness, but only 8 of those are actually receiving the care they need. So there's a disparity between diagnosis and treatment for those combating mental illness. And this is no new thing to the church, especially because determinants of mental health and mental health disorder include not only individual attributes, but social, culture, and economic, political, and environmental factors. Religion and spirituality often play a vital role in healing. People experiencing mental health concerns often turn to their faith leader first. So this disparity becomes further debilitating as we look at the role of Christianity, specifically as it relates to mental wellness. In 2017, it was estimated that 70% of the US population identified as Christian. And of those, so if you take that group of 100 again, 70 of those would have been considered Christians. And of those, only when you look at the pastoring and what pastors do and the caretaking that spiritual caretakers do, in 2017, 6 out of 10 pastors counseled someone who eventually was diagnosed with mental illness. Now, among those pastors, 49% rarely spoke or never spoke about the church mental health in their sermons or large group messages. So you have a majority of pastors who have counseled someone, but only half of those pastors are actually speaking about mental illness from a pulpit or from a larger perspective. So again, I mentioned to you how it's 100 people. If we have a room of 100 people, 20 would have mental illness. And we overlay those statistics with the 70% of Christians, we see that Christianity and those who practice Christianity are not exempt from mental illness whatsoever. And yet, only half of those individuals are hearing messages from their pulpit as faith and the role of faith and mental wellness. So there, again, there's this disconnect between faith and wellness and how those two interact with each other. Let's see. So I'm going to stop very quickly to see if there's any questions before we move into research and findings. To just that, and that was just a foundation to try to lay the foundation for what's going on. And Dr. Jackson, I do see, yeah, it's definitely nothing to be ashamed of, and it's definitely not a sin. And as we look at gatekeepers, again, it can be anyone. So it could be any of us. Doesn't have to be clergy, doesn't have to just be those who have been called to the ministry of the preaching ministry, but it could be those who are in contact. We have Sunday school teachers, church leaders, anybody leading a small group or discipleship. Those are the individuals who become the first responders to mental illness. And so those Christians with mental illness are less likely to hear and engage in the gospel that strengthens their faith and promotes well-being if it's not done from the pulpit. So what did I do? I decided to conduct my own research in accordance with the IRB of Livingstone College and the psychology department. And the study consisted of a quantitative and a qualitative response through 57 questions. The survey included demographic questions as well as perceptions regarding substance abuse, willingness to refer congregants, and the work with mental health professionals, as well as clergy preparedness. Participants ranged in age from 18 to 64 plus, but the median age range was around 50 to 64. All participants, because of the denomination I serve, which is the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, the majority of the clergy within the denomination are African American, and participants reflected that as well. So here's the findings in the research, but I just want to highlight a few things. Findings show that 80% of clergy within the AME Zion Church, I just want to keep saying that, agreed or strongly agreed that they could recognize a person with a serious mental health condition or challenge. 13 out of 15 clergy said that they do not believe that a church member often lacks faith when they are going through a mental health challenge. And then 2/3 of those clergy then agreed or strongly agreed that persons with a serious mental health challenge could be possessed by demons. So we have the majority of clergy saying that they could recognize a person, but then 2/3 saying that it's not, or it could be related to a demon possession. But yet then the majority of the clergy also said that they didn't believe that it was related to lacking faith or a spiritual issue. Out of those clergy, 12 out of 15 agreed that church members usually feel more comfortable receiving pastoral counseling than going to a mental health professional. Clergy showed a high willingness to refer members facing sexual abuse, domestic violence, depression, and addiction, respectively, in that order. Clergy were less willing to refer members to professionals for racism, work, parenting, adjusting to life, and finances. So when we asked clergy what was the frequency of their encounters or how often were they referring people, clergy said that they were more likely to encounter members who were facing abuse, substance abuse problems, marriage and family problems, more so than mental health, violence, and sexual abuse. 7 out of 15 clergy had not made a referral, though, for mental health in the last 6 months. Clergy showed a likelihood to consult with mental health professionals about church members and mental health issues, but when asked about integration of a licensed professional, 40% of clergy were unsure or not likely to allow a mental health professional to have an office in their church. Wow. Okay. How does this translate into actions? All clergy responded with the likelihood of making a referral for a mental health professional when the circumstances were beyond their control. Yet, in the scope of everything, again, 7 out of 15 clergy had not made a referral for mental health. All, again, responded with the likelihood to consider making a referral for a mental health professional when the circumstances were beyond their control. But 7 out of 15 had not made a referral in the last 6 months. So, conclusively, from my study, what I learned was that clergy claim to have a knowledge related to mental health, but do not act on such knowledge. Data suggests that clergy understand mental illness as being psychological. However, they still attribute it to concepts of religious or demon possession. Clergy's religious core beliefs about mental illness influence both their attitudes, perceptions towards mental health. They further impact parishioners' attitudes and behaviors towards treatment. So my big statement is this: clergy have a tendency to overpromise in rhetoric and underpresent in practice. So again, I'll pause just for a moment to see if there's any questions related to what's been said, what's been going on. Yes, Dr. Jackson, I would like to see clergy talking about mental wellness from the pulpit. And we'll go into what that looks like and what I hope that could be shaped as going forward. But I would definitely like to see that. Quinty, you're right. Clergy do they're not therapists. And a lot of times clergy have this tendency to put on as if we can answer everything and we have all the answers instead of referring out, right? And that can get us into trouble if we're not careful. And it also can do more harm than good for parishioners. Yes, I believe, Yvonne Johnson, I do believe that therapists, church leaders, I believe everyone needs a therapist at some point in their life. Um, from years of therapy, that's just a core belief for me. Everybody can benefit from a therapist at some point to help them function better and more efficiently in life, because we all have a little bit of dysfunction, and if we're not careful, our dysfunction can run over to other people. So I'm going to stop right there, and I want you all to begin to think about your interaction with those who suffer or are battling mental illness. What has been your experience? How has that made you feel? Think about in terms of what emotions did you experience while you were talking to them? How did you feel during that moment? Were you present? Were you trying to escape that moment from talking to them? And just kind of drop your kind of emotions down in the bottom. I work with youth as well, so a lot of times I tell them to drop an emoji. But if you can verbalize how you felt, definitely share that in the comments, and we'll keep going through some of the rhetoric and things that we yes, and the stats will be available later as well. And just talk about, some of those emotions that you feel when you encounter someone, whether you know them or you do not know them. How did you feel when you're engaging them? Because if we're not aware of how we feel, then we're not aware of what's necessarily happening in that moment. So like right now, one thing that is I've learned in therapy is to ground myself. And grounding helps me to recognize what I'm feeling in that particular moment. So like right now, I'm nervous, but that I'm aware of what my emotions are. And so that then I'm able to guide and maneuver how I respond in those moments. So definitely drop your emotions and how are you feeling at this point, and just share some of your experiences. I think it'd be helpful for the entire group to know, how have you dealt with mental illness, and how have you dealt with engaging people that are dealing with it, or even caretakers who are dealing with it. Santiago Amanez, in his article Christianity and Mental Illness, Evil or Sickness, discusses how literature shows that Christians tend to reiterate misinformation about stigmas associated with mental illness. He suggests that Christians, Pentecostals specifically, do not look at mental illness from a worldview or an interrelated cause. Excuse me. He also said that they do not look at it from a pathopsychological or a pathophysiological terms. Instead, he suggested that many Christians view mental illness as part of sin and ultimately humanity's brokenness. This approach does not lend itself to the individual, but creates a cookie cutter method for addressing mental illness. Such methods influence our rhetoric, and they also influence the groups that we serve, and then it leads to further implications. So I just want to share with you on the screen is several phrases that we've kind of heard over the time. Pray about it, give it to God, too blessed to be stressed, right? Some of us have that on the front of our cars. I rebuke that spirit. Don't let the devil have your mind. A double-minded individual is unstable. God would never put more on you than you can bear. Recently, I heard someone say the church is bipolar, and that the church has schizophrenic ways. Just have faith, or engaging in some type of spiritual warfare. But on the other side of this, there are implications for using such language. It implies that spirituality is enough to cope with psychiatric vulnerabilities. It removes the involvement of the individual and places the responsibility solely on God. It implies that mental disorders are optional and that one who is demon possessed is not function. One, that someone is demon possessed, and two, that individual is not functioning as God intended. And it devalues their current experience. It places God as giving mental illness and that God wills for mental conditions as a way to bring about glory. And then it creates a stereotype when we use mental, um, when we use medical terminology, right, to describe the church. It creates a stereotype for mental illness and promotes that stigma further. And it leads to an overcompensation of individuals for faith. So if you've ever seen someone in your congregation who just works in the church, but they're not necessarily dealing with what's going on internally, it's overcompensation of faith. And they may not necessarily feel comfortable sharing that. So they just continue to work in your church and take on positions and things like that. So I'm going to go through these very quickly because I do want to get to the last piece about thinking through our theology. Brad Hamburg wrote, is mental illness a physical event with spiritual side effects or a spiritual event with physical side effects? Does emotions trigger biology or biology trigger choices and emotions? So as we think through our theology, we have to look at how do we view God? How do we view creation? And how do we view sin? Those are the bases: God, creation, and sin. And then we take that framework and then we look at how that's applied to suffering, salvation, and then the afterlife. Remember, mental illness is characterized by a combination of abnormal thoughts, perceptions, emotions, behaviors, and relationships with others. These can be seen in suffering, salvation, and an afterlife. So, new language. That's where we are. That's where I hope for us to go as we rethink church. As we look forward, mental health is the foundation for things such as communication, learning, resilience, and self-esteem in individuals. Mental health is a key to personal well-being and relationships, and it's a contributor to community. So we have to be looking at ways to be inclusive in our language. Does your language that you use in the pulpit related to mental illness allow for acceptance? Does it affirm the struggle of the individual? Does it allow for compassion to be given, grace to be given? Does it allow individuals to embrace the moment that they're in that moment? Does it uplift? Does it encourage? Does it liberate their souls and liberate their minds? Does it love? Does it share authentic hope? Okay, we can, and when I say we, I'm not indicting on anyone in particular, but as a whole, we have seen the church offer faith and hope that is artificial. So what does a realistic hope look like? When we say things will get better, but necessarily how will they get better? Or what does get better look like? Because everyone looks for this utopia as it relates to mental illness and mental conditions. And the truth of the matter is, it's a constant journey towards better, but there's not necessarily a utopia. There's no cure at this moment for mental conditions. There's only treatment and management. And so how does that look in sharing authentic hope? And then does it promote realistic healing? So I'll stop there and let's just have a conversation about what's going on. So Quinta, are there any questions?
There's several. Let me scroll back up. I don't know how far to go. Okay, so here's one that says, how many clergy have experienced the benefits of mental, and I'm assuming that was like mental wellness. That's Angela Brown. We have a lot of comments. Let me start with this one that I did see. How can we rethink mental health in the church? So that's one of them, and I'll find the others.
Sure. So we can rethink mental health in the church by beginning to look at the biblical narratives. I'll show the slides. We probably won't have time to go through them, but feel free to message me and we can have further discussion. But I will show some of the biblical narratives that offer us a chance to be able to talk about mental illness and mental health, right? So one of my favorites probably is Elijah. I tend to identify with Elijah's hopelessness and despair under the juniper tree after he ran from Jezebel, right? Like he's on the top of the mountain and then he's called down fire and then his life is threatened in some way. And he runs in fear, as many of us do. And so being able to talk through what actually occurs, not the miracle under the juniper tree. Like we jump ahead and we say, you know, God provides under the juniper tree. But that very moment when you're under a juniper tree in life and life has become so much that you are hopeless and you don't see a future, and what's being presented to you becomes that moment of despair. And even though you know that God is able, because that's where many of our parishioners will find themselves in right now, especially with COVID. They know the scriptures, they know that God is able, but what's in front of them, with job loss and with the COVID running rampant, that brings hopelessness and despair because it hasn't ended, right? Like we thought this was going to be like a month thing, and now it's become, you know, we're 6 months into the year or 7 months and we're still here wearing face masks. So those type of hopelessness and despair, that's where we need to begin to talk about it. And then as we approach it from a biblical standpoint, you then integrate pieces of, you can talk to somebody, go see someone, talk to a therapist and things like that. I hope that answers that question.
Another question was, are therapists available to give overviews of the difference between pastoral care and professional therapy?
I would say so. So my therapist is a licensed minister. So she and she's in a different denomination where they kind of abide by some different rules. Like I think it's three sessions if she's in a pastoral session, and then she refers them out. And so I would say yes. I learned the difference between pastoral care and professional care in seminary. But I would say any Christian therapist should be able to speak to that situation.
Yeah, and I think just to kind of piggyback on that, that's one of the things as ministers, as pastors, we have to learn that um, we don't have all the answers, and so we have to be willing to give up some of that control or that expertise, because as you have stated, Angellica, has been stated in the chat, pastors have their limitations, and we have to accept that. Another question, do pastors not speak to mental illness from the pulpit because it is considered a taboo topic in the Black community?
So statistically, it's shown that across the board, whether it's African American clergy or other races, that clergy just in general are not speaking towards mental illness. I think we're seeing more people trying to approach that topic because it's I don't want to call it popular right now, but it is very current and real. Especially, and then when you look at the Black church, we're multi-layered, right? Like there's multiple things that contribute to that. It's communal, that we've always kind of said, like, what goes on in this house stays in this house. So if it goes on in this house, we're not really necessarily, even the pastor, right? Like that's part of, like, he's part of the community. So what goes on in that, or he or she, excuse me, what's going on in their house is staying in their house. And so that apprehension carries over to when we're in the pulpit. And then there's other barriers also, because as African Americans, we have multiple layers that are on us, right? We have this racial tension, and we have poverty and gentrification happening. And so sometimes those issues get pushed to the top, and our mental wellness and our conversation about mental wellness gets pushed down on the totem pole. And it's just part of the nature that happens.
Okay, next question. Do you believe church leaders should see a therapist to help them function with so many other personalities in the church?
Yes. Absolutely, yes. Any therapist would tell you they have a therapist, right? And I think it should be the same for church leaders. Like, you have to be able to share that information with someone else who can help you process and help you effectively minister. So yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah, I'm here. Someone wanted to know about your research and is it published anywhere?
It is not published because it was part of my undergraduate thesis. So I have not really taken the time out. I moved straight into divinity school to get it published, but I do have it. It is available. If you drop an email or leave me a chat or DM, I'll be able to share that research with you.
Okay, our next question. Oh, there's more up here. Okay, let me scroll up. I don't want to miss one. How imperative will it be to have therapists and mental health experts on staff within our churches?
I think as we move forward, I think that we already should have had mental health professionals on staff. Some research suggests that I think I saw in one of the Lifeway research articles that a crisis team is necessary, because the truth of the matter is mental illness has no respect of person, and it has no respect of place. So you could have someone in your church that has a breakdown in service. And so how do you handle that? Because you can't just pray that moment away, right? So I think it's important that we keep people who are trained on staff. That also includes laypersons being able to be mental health first aid certified. That's a course that's offered. It takes about I think it was 2 days I sat in a course for that. But you can become mental health first aid certified. And that's something that I think that any leader, if you're going to have them engaging with people, that's the bare minimum we could do, is to get those persons certified. And then also, as we have those giftings in our body, tapping into them and asking them, hey, do you mind, being on staff, a crisis intervention staff? I just think it's necessary at this point.
Certainly. And just to add that, I do know that I believe it's with the CBF denomination, or actually organization, they have a crisis team that specifically deals with mental health. So some of you that might be interested, reaching out to their local or regional offices to kind of see how that's structured. So that's a possible resource for us. Another question. What is the most practical way for a church to create a relationship with a professional therapist? And what are some great resources?
Sure. So practical, just have a conversation, right? If you know of someone who's counseling, that would be the first step. If you don't know of anyone who is actual licensed or practicing therapist or counselor, begin that conversation. Typically, you can tap into the hospital system, who has chaplains and see people who are going through CPE, right? Those individuals will be able to kind of direct you into your first line of resources. Also, consider your nonprofit resources, American Red Cross. My mind is drawing a blank on the other one. But I know the American Red Cross does some work as well with mental health counselors. Those nonprofits, as well as, like I said, the hospital, any atrium system. I'm in North Carolina, so any atrium system, any Novant system will have those hospital chaplains, and they'll be able to provide you with resources. Quincy, can you tell me the second part of that question again?
It asks about the resources. What resources would be good?
Right. Okay. So the National Institute of Health will always have resources available right now. The World Health Organization is having resources, especially during the time of COVID. Um, Additional resources, and I talked about it somewhere in my PowerPoint, the American, I'm going to mess up the acronym for it. I want to say it's the American Association of Psychological Health. But I'll put it in the chat. They also have some resources available as well.
I guess this is a follow-up question to that is, would that normally be a paid position, like having a therapist on staff?
I'm probably going to get in trouble for this. I say yes. I say yes, and I chuckle because a lot of times in the African American church, we see that people want professionals, but they don't want to pay for professionals. And so I chuckle just ever so lightly because I believe that it should be a paid position because it is a licensed position, right? That individual can bill whatever insurance carrier if they're on staff and providing counseling services. So that's my answer. That's my safe answer. Find me during the networking session.
And there are several people who are requesting your research, and they have left their email, but I'm going to ask all of you to just network with Angellica through the platform so that you all can actually exchange information, and that way she can definitely have it and get that information to you. But I think that was the last question that I saw. And I know that she's going to be more than willing to share the PowerPoint as well. Some people posted some websites already as far as resources are concerned. But if there's no more questions, we're just going to give Angellica the last 3 minutes of her time to kind of bring it all in for us.
Okay. So I definitely appreciate the engagement and the interaction that has occurred today. It is a step of faith for me to continue this work. It is something that I'm passionate about. Sometimes in life, I think that we never know where our path is going. And you definitely couldn't have told me as an 8th grader who thought life was over that this was going to be my path and this was going to be my passion. And so I'm grateful for those who have stayed on and joined today, who have shared their stories and shared their truth. That is all that this is about, right? Sharing the truth that comes forth not only in our lives, but in the biblical narrative. As I leave and, as the preacher I am, I say as I close, a piece of what I want to leave you with, we've just celebrated Pentecost not too long ago, and the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 2, verses 4 and 6. Chapter 2, verses 1 through 4 and verse 6 talks about what it means to be enabled by the Spirit to begin to speak. And it talks about divided tongues as fire appeared upon the people, and a tongue rested on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them the ability. And at the sound, the crowd gathered was bewildered because each one heard them speaking in their native language. And in closing, we must begin to speak in our native language that empowers people. It may leave some people bewildered, but it's necessary that we have a new language to describe what's going on, not only in the scriptures, but also in life. We must match our lived experience, not only our lived experience, but the lived experience of our parishioners to a perceived reality of faith. New language affords us the opportunity to minister to the individual and acknowledge their issues of faith that is otherwise noted in mental illness. Rhetoric must place into context illness, identity, character, and chemistry. How we share can either add or alleviate some of the barriers to mental health. So again, thank you so much Language is a daily development. And just like babies start with cooing and then move to babble, building language that helps to promote mental wellness takes time. And so I thank you today for taking that time out to begin to journey with me on building that language. And I hope to hear from some of you all soon. So thank you again.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Angellica. We hope you all, well, I know you all gleaned a lot from her. And so we have a 15-minute break. This is an excellent time to go ahead and start networking with Angellica and you all, swapping information and just picking her brain with all of her knowledge. So please take these next 15 minutes or so, and we will see you back here at 12:45 for our next session. Thank you all.
Thank you.